Walking a path along the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road to the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether the staff and other customers are hiding a secret from us. At a corner table by the fire are two people. One of them has an elaborate theory on the subject and is just waiting for the right moment to reveal it. And that's me, Matthew Mullema. Welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. Here at Believe to See, we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. Our goal is to help you connect the great story, the great stories, and our own stories in order to understand what it means to live with a Christian imagination. So, dear listeners, as I've probably mentioned a few too many times, I write middle grade fantasy fiction. Now allow me to switch into my advertising voice. My debut novel, Red Rex, will be forthcoming from Bandersnatch Books in November 2024. Go back to regular voice. So as part of that process, I read a lot of plot synopses in the middle grade and YA fantasy spheres. And as such, you get to know a lot of the typical premises, the standard plot devices for these sort of books. But when I read the plot synopsis for our guest's YA fantasy novel, I had a thought. Oh, that sounds really interesting, I thought. That's a really great premise. The novel is called Once a Queen, and its publication date is January 30th, 2024. And depending on when we end up posting this episode, it either means it's right about to debut or it has just debuted. Its author is Sarah Arthur. Now, Sarah Arthur has actually been on this show before to talk about a nonfiction book she wrote about Madeleine L'Engle. She's written about a dozen other books, mainly also in the nonfiction sphere, most prominently Frodo, A Devotional Journey Through Lord of the Rings. She's also been a fiction judge for Christianity Today and has been a board member of the annual C.S. Lewis Festival in Northern Michigan. At any rate, it's way up north where it is very cold, and it is a great C.S. Lewis Festival. And she is kind enough to join us here at the table. So welcome, Sarah Arthur.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, I am very excited to talk about this book because, again, you would know this very well, that you read a lot of middle grade, you read a lot of YA, you start to learn the beats, but I really, really liked what you did here, so I can't wait to talk about it. But before we do that, let's talk about your background in writing. So like I mentioned earlier, the last time you were on this show, you were talking about a nonfiction book you wrote about Madeleine L'Engle.
Right.
Now you're going to the fiction realm. So what caused the switch from the nonfiction over to the fiction?
It's how much time you got, because if you, like me in your writing life, have just been kind of following the twists and turns of where balancing career and family and all of that kind of stuff and education takes you, then it's, I would have wanted to have published fiction 20 years ago. But after being in youth ministry and working with teenagers and just watching how their minds and hearts and imaginations came alive to stories and the power of stories formatively and spiritually, that is really when I began to, think about how can we have more engaging conversations about literature and about great stories and great film with teenagers. And so out of that came Walking with Frodo, A Devotional Journey Through the Lord of the Rings. And it was a book about the Lord of the Rings. It was not me writing fiction, which is really my first love. So out of Walking with Frodo came lots of other books related to the intersection of faith and great literature, including what I was on the podcast before about, which was basically like a spiritual biography of Madeleine L'Engle, who wrote A Wrinkle in Time. And that one is called A Light So Lovely, The Spiritual Legacy of Madeleine L'Engle. So I keep writing about authors who are writing fiction. And finally, at long last, my childhood dream is coming true. And it's just, it feels like I'm kind of at a pinch me moment, 20 years in this career. And so hold on to those dreams, everybody. You never know. You just never know. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the nonfiction that you did, right? So
Mhm,
you mentioned, you've written about Madeline L'Engle.
mhm, mhm,
You wrote books involving like Lord of the Rings,
mhm.
all these other works on authors. Do you feel that that sort of work you did had an influence on the novel that you eventually wrote?
Oh, well, I mean, anytime you're writing, you're doing reps, right? It's like basketball practice. I mean, you just show up at the gym and you keep doing those drills and you've got to um it doesn't matter kind of what genre you're working in. You're learning your own pacing, you're learning your own strengths as a writer, and also trying, and in many cases for me at least failing, to balance the creative life with everything else. And regardless of what kind of genre you're writing in, um I think that the strengths of maybe the best thing I learned was reading Tolkien and writing about Tolkien, reading Lewis, writing about Lewis, and Madeline L'Engle. I wrote about Jane Austen, did a book for teen girls on called Dating Mr. Darcy. And like reading all of these authors from the past, and realizing that for a lot of them, even Jane, who was the daughter of a clergyman, writing was really a calling, and not just a hobby, not just like a something they did on the side. It was their true vocation. And Madeline, especially Madeline L'Engle, would say, "We show up and serve the work." And that has, I think, been really important as I've been writing fiction now.
Yeah, so that's really good going to, the purpose of writing fiction in showing the like you said, the calling that writers can have. How about the content? Like, do you feel like there's anything like let's take an example. Do you think there's anything in Once a Queen where you're like, ah, I put this in there because I was reading so much Langle. That's Langle that has Langle written all over it.
Oh, there's so much. I mean, like, actually, it's really cute. My son Micah is 13. He's on my launch team for Once a Queen. So like we have this whole teen launch team, and they get to write a little review. And his review was, the more you read this book over and over, the more you see all of the hidden surprises, right? And I, some of those surprises were surprises even to me as a writer. Like I went back and read a chapter and been like, oh my gosh, that's straight up E. Nesbit. I can't believe I didn't even notice that before. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think the longer that we marinate in the authors that we love, the more and more that flavor is going to come out in whatever we do. We see that in Lewis too. He was hugely influenced by George MacDonald, hugely influenced by Chesterton. And you see that in his work. I mean, you see echoes of Hans Christian Andersen, E. Nesbitt. There's nobody who's like a completely original genius except God. And so some of what I've included is very intentional. I want it to evoke those stories, fairy tales, especially that we love, fantasy stories that we loved. And some of it was completely like not. It just appeared. And later I was like, oh my gosh, that's The Hobbit all over the place. And I just didn't even notice.
Funny how the Hobbit can just sneak into things like that.
Oh, yeah.
But that's actually a good transition now. So let's talk about the book. Again,
Mhm.
Once a Queen. I'm sure you've been doing this a lot. Let's hear that elevator pitch. What is your book about?
My book, oh my goodness. In 20 years, you'd think I'd have a really fantastic elevator pitch by now. That's how long I've been thinking about this story and working on parts of this story. So, 14-year-old Eva Joyce goes to England and meets her British grandmother for the first time. She does not understand why there's this estrangement between her mother and her grandmother. She doesn't know why. She's never met her grandmother before. And while she is there for part of the summer that she's 14, she begins to suspect that the stories she read, the fairy tales that she read as a kid about people who traveled to other worlds and returned, were maybe true. And she begins to think and suspect that her grandmother was once one of those people. That's the premise.
All right. Very nice. And again, that's the premise that made me go, oh, okay. So you mentioned that this seems like it's been sort of a story you've been working on for a long time. So
Mhm.
what's the genesis of this?
Um, oh, usually it's something really boring, like I was trying to avoid a deadline for something else. And an idea came to me and I was like, "Oh, let's get distracted by that so we don't have to work on what we're supposed to be working on." But actually what got me thinking about it was the really strange, and I notice authorial narrative devices all the time. Like, what gave the author idea to include that? That's just so weird. And it was, I can't remember exactly how I got onto this, but I was thinking, where did where did someone like C.S. Lewis get the idea to like kill a bunch of people in a train crash? So sorry, spoilers for
Oh, spoiler
who
alert.
hasn't
Yeah.
read the Chronicles of Narnia by now. Um, like, where does that come from, right? Especially, he would have to make that believable to children. So to me, it was like, okay, so these kids who are his readers have survived World War II. So like maybe it was something during the war, maybe something during the war. There was a train crash or something like that. So I look up like British rail crashes. And sure enough, in October of 1952, there was um, still to this day the largest civilian rail crash in British history. It killed like over 100 people because it was three trains colliding right at rush hour. One of them was a commuter train going super fast, or the high speed train. Well, not high speed back then, but it was like a through train, like it wasn't going to be stopping. And so I was just like, what? And then I looked at the timeline. I kind of went back and looked at timelines of when he was writing different books. And The Last Battle was something he was working on that very fall. And I thought, okay, so like legit people died in the train crash. So there were survivors of it. There were people who lost family members. So I started to research this thing, and since then I'm not the only one who's written about this or even written, fantasy related books. There's the wonderful Inkwell Chronicles books, but and I was so bummed because I read those and I was like, oh, I was the one who discovered the rail crash, but I wasn't, of course, because it's a historical thing. But like, there's like the 50th anniversary of the rail crash in 2002, and like people who lost family members were there in the little church in, London. So I just thought, wow, what if there's some way that a family was affected by that but won't talk about it, and I can tell their story um from the perspective of I just remember being the teenager who was like, why are the adults so weird, and why are they acting this way, and why are they grumpy, and what's going on? And I'm a kid from a great family, right? Like, it's not like it was like this tormented, generations of tormented people. So yeah, like I just remember that feeling of being like, why is this normal? Like, why are people this way? And so I wanted to kind of capture that feeling and tell a family story about tragedy and loss, and kind of the loss of faith too in the midst of all that. So yeah. So there's a lot more hope and joy in the story than that, just so you know.
Yes, you started by saying that your story was inspired by a massive railway
It
accident, but
Children
it
died.
does
I
get
mean,
better
it's
from
yeah.
there.
Oh, yeah.
It's much cheerier than you'd
It
think from that, so don't
really
worry.
it really is. Golly, I just started that on a very dark note. Sorry. Uh,
But
yeah.
no, but I think that is so fascinating where that's sort of the germ of the idea. And then I want to talk about the fairy tales that you weave in.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
on this podcast, we're huge fans of fairy tales. We
Yay.
talk about them all the time. Why did you choose these specific ones that you did, and how'd you go about doing that?
Um, Well, so there's a couple layers to this. Of course, I'm constantly evoking the fairy tales that we all know and love from growing up. I'm, evoking The Hobbit and A Wrinkle in Time, which is kind of sci-fi slash fantasy, but I still think that there's a bit of the fairy tale in there. Um, Hans Christian Andersen and E. Nesbitt and C.S. Lewis, and it's all there. But I really wanted to ground my story in tales. Like I make up these sort of like fictional tales that my characters will have read, and so there are excerpts from those in between each chapter. And of course, they evoke all of those favorite stories, right? They're absolutely no mistaking that influence. Um, but what was really fun is that I was able to do my own thing with them and like build a world that was sort of self-contained. So it's not referential to stuff outside of um, like the world that I'm building there. But if you want to layer all of those other stories in there as you're reading, it totally works too, which was part of the fun of that. Yeah.
Yeah, what was it like to write your own fairy tales? How'd you go about that?
Um, I can't not. Sorry. I'm just like it's constant. My poor brain. Like some days I'm just like just take a break. It's really okay. It's just it's a storytelling. I have Tolkien's what he called an epic temperament. Like it just doesn't like one story leads to another story leads to another story. But I wanted to create a world in which it feels familiar, but then it you enter a place where um, I wanted to place women in kind of the role of the sovereigns in the realm, like that they kind of really guide and steer the story. So it's like there's the queens play a really big role in my stories. Um and that was kind of fun because I'm not doing that to make some sort of point. I just am trying to think of like, okay, my who are my readers and what would like inspire them or intrigue them. So yeah, so that was fun. So like there's a high queen, for instance, and there's like the writ of queens, and there's a character named Andala who is hunting in the woods. She's an archeress, and she's attacked by a wolf, climbs up in a tree to escape. And for a moment, I was like, oh, maybe her, the prince should come and save her. And I was like, no, no, Angela's going to solve this problem herself. So she does, and I say, she's the mother of queens, right? Like it's not just that she's the mother of the next king; she's the mother of queens, and so she has in her the strength to fight this beast, and so she does. And that was fun. It was me just being like, oh, I get to write this as a 21st century author. Like I don't have to, just fill all those tropes like that we're used to.
Yeah, and something I'm also really interested in is your main character. So Eva Joyce.
Hmm.
So let's start nuts and bolts here because this is something, as you can probably guess, I have been very preoccupied with is the age of my protagonist, right?
Yes, 100.
So I'm writing a middle grade fantasy novel where the kids they need to be able to be respectable in a sword fight. You know how it
Right.
works. So I want to set it up high enough for that, but you don't want it too high where like I don't want to tread into YA. I like my middle
Mhm,
grade area.
mhm.
So why did you settle on 14? I am very curious.
That was a super intentional choice. So in all of the years that I have talked with publishers, different publishing houses about this story, um, sometimes they wanted it to be middle grade, more adventure, that 8 to 12-year-old age range, um, you know, much more like the E Nesbit, like, you've got these kids that are doing stuff. But I've been so interested in Eva and her relationship with her grandmother. And family relationships are just a thing that, like, as we're wading through from childhood to adulthood, we're starting to navigate differently than we did as younger kids. And as early teens begin to make their turn their face to adulthood, They're trying to understand the world around them. Eva isn't sure if she should give up the fairy tales that she used to believe. She really wants to still believe them, but she thinks you have to give them up as you grow up. But she doesn't want to. But now here she's interacting with this grown adult who wants nothing to do with fairy tales, right? So maybe this is the future that you have to choose. That's not middle grade stuff. That's, but it also isn't um, YA issues driven. It's relationship driven. Um, it's about that fear of like what we have to lose as we grow up, not what we gain in terms of like all the experimenting we get to do, supposedly in YA. I find Sarah Mackenzie with the Read Aloud Revival really helpful. She describes YA as a genre, not just an age level. And if you just like some kids are just not going to be into issues driven YA stuff. They just aren't. But there is no category for what I want, which is young teen. I want a YT category for ages 12, 13, 14, 15 ish, right? Like, and then for everybody who ever loved middle grade and are still are like 18, 19, 20, they don't feel like they're reading a kid's book. Like they're reading something with a little more depth and meat to it. So that's where
Can I say,
that's where
if you want to start the young teen genre, I will be right behind you. Yep. We will be I will happily put the young teen label on my book because like you said, it's so weird because in some respects, a lot of this categorization, a lot of the genre difference is on the surface level, the age of the protagonist, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're 15 or older, it's YA. If you're 13 or younger, it's middle grade, which can make a difference at that age, but it is a little arbitrary. But then if you read a middle grade book, there's certain conventions, there's certain things you're allowed to say, not say. YA, there's certain expectations of like angst and stuff.
Angst and experimenting with stuff you maybe shouldn't be. And like, all the things that people think teenagers are supposed to be doing.
What we need is something in the middle where you're old enough to be in a plausible sword fight, but you're not so old that you're just brooding all day with.
And I wait to read the sword fight, by the way. I can't wait to read. No, straight up, it's and what a magical age is 14. I'm sorry. It's amazing. You're so much is changing and you're realizing what you're having to give up from your childhood. Like I was actually born with a sense of nostalgia. So I did not want to grow up and leave behind all those things that I loved. I didn't want the grown-up responsibilities. And I know I'm not the only kid like that, or I wasn't the only kid like that. All the expectations that people put on teenagers, I did not. I was like, why would I want to go to that party? I want to be home reading a book. So I was weird, but I know there's other weird ones out there. So my book goes out to all the weird kids that at 14, still loved fairy tales.
Oh man, you are so right, because that is you are just where you're supposed to leave quote unquote childhood behind. And a lot of it's like the surface trappings. You're supposed to be interested in like romantic partners. You're supposed to be interested in parties and being popular. And it's so bewildering and it's so scary. I could probably break out in cold sweats just thinking about being 14 again. Perfect age for a protagonist.
Yes. I mean, I'm like, it's like built in to the age. It's just built in. What I also think is missed in a lot of, I've been in youth ministry for 25 years. Fresh out of college, I was a full-time youth director. I've been volunteering in youth ministry ever since. I have a 13-year-old now. I substitute teach as a middle school teacher in a public school district here in Lansing, Michigan. Kids are my thing. And I really believe that we shortchange them on continuing to develop relational skills within in cross generations. They get siloed into their age group and they don't get a chance to have conversations with grownups besides teachers, coaches, and parents. They need faith communities, some of them, because it might be one of the only places where they get that. And they don't get to interact with younger children much, where they get to play the role of the mentor and the cool kids. So um, I think books can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was something, I was looking at the product details page for your book, and one of the things I'm guessing is something you and your publishers had a lot of long conversations about is you are categorized under teen and young adult multi-generational
Hmm.
fiction. So
Hmm.
can absolutely see where that's an emphasis
Yeah.
for you. And I I totally agree. And that is something that it's very easy to miss, especially in the YA middle grade sphere, because and this can be really cool, right? It's so tempting to have like the team, like the squad of like all of the peers, right? So it's the protagonist and like the team of other misfits who band together into an unlikely family, et cetera, which is all really good. I like that.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to be said for interacting with other age groups as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's at least for my story, you know, she does have she has a 15-year-old friend. His name is Frankie that she meets there. He's part of this, he's part of the staff at her grandmother's estate. Of course, her grandmother has an estate. Um,
I mean, come
and
on.
of course, and there are other older people all connected to this history of the grandmother story, and various generations. And then Frankie has younger siblings who, as I was writing the first book, uh, I didn't realize it would be a series, but that's what ended up getting pitched and accepted by my publisher. So book two comes out after this, Once a
Oh,
Castle.
very
I'm
nice.
writing it right now, and Frankie's siblings then are then like 13, 14, 15, and that's their turn for their story. And I'm having so much fun with that because they do kind of gather a team, and it is kind of some of the misfits from these different families, but it's also like grown-ups, like there are grown-ups in it, and then the younger brother who's kind of annoying, Georgie. But a lot of that, there's if you're familiar with the writing of Madeline L'Engle, a lot of her, especially young adult and middle grade stuff, is very similar. Wrinkle in Time, family story. It's siblings and their friend going to rescue her father. I mean, it's like so. Yeah, I feel like I'm in a pretty strong tradition that I'd love to see more of. In children and young adult literature.
Yeah, and related to that is the topic of theme, which I always like discussing. And it seems like different authors come about this totally different ways, right? Some will be like, I tell the story, and as I'm writing it, the theme sort of emerges. Others, like me, because I'm a nerd who likes to outline, like have a theme that they want to try to incorporate.
Mm.
Where do you fall on that spectrum, or do you reject my spectrum for something else entirely?
Oh, I do think that this story has kind of a mind of its own. I mean, this was actually something Madeline L'Engle wrote about a lot, was this idea that the story comes to us and says, create me, right? Like, here I am, create me. And we have the opportunity to kind of birth this thing into the world. We're the doula that's like there helping bring this thing into being. And in some ways we can be like, we have a sense of what this is going to be, but it also, um, that's part of the magic of the creative process, is watching things unfold. And I knew I wanted themes of like, leaving childhood behind and what do you have to give up when you do, themes of, what does it look like to walk alongside of somebody who has experienced such loss that they cannot, that they have closed their heart to parts of their past, like they just cannot go back there. And in an equivalent way, like maybe a loss of faith, right? Like, how do I still stay in the mess with this person and still love them, even when the sort of long-term future is uncertain, right? Where will this story land? Will this be a tragedy, or will this have a happy ending for them? And the recognition that Eva can't tell her grandmother's story. It's not her story. She can only have her own story. And of course, this is a huge theme for Madeline, for Lewis. Like, it's uh, that to me was a really important thing for Eva to realize.
Yeah, and then we're running a little low on time, but I want to finish by talking about your next plans for the series,
Mhm.
which you have hinted at
Yeah.
already.
Yep.
So When did you first realize that this one book was actually a series? And do you have like is it a 2-parter, 3-parter, ... What are you thinking with that?
Oh, if only all of us could be Madeline L'Engle and just like write whatever we want next and just be like, yeah, this sort of connects to Wrinkle in Time. And this family is, the Austins are doing their thing and I'll write about them. And because I have so many other things. I think it really became real to me when my wonderful editor at Waterbrook, Sarah Rubio, looked over the materials that my agent sent her and was like, this can work. And she pitched it to, her people as a 3-part series, and that's what was offered to us. And so all of a sudden I was like, oh, this is real. Oh, I've got to make this happen now. I can't just like write a little paragraph about, and if you want more books like this, I could write something, maybe Once a Castle. I don't know. So Once a Castle is next, starring Jack, who is Frankie's like middle brother. And then a number of other kids that are that I introduce especially towards the end of Once a Queen, and then they'll show up. And then probably Once a Crown is what I'm thinking about for book 3. And I have I know where it's going. Can't say too much about it, but yeah, that's the plan right now.
I love it. That is fantastic. Okay, I can just picture the brain. Once a Kingdom, Once a Once a Crown's good. I think you're in a good place with it.
Yeah. There's lots of I mean, my agent has a coworker who was like, oh, it could be like Once a Knave. And we were coming Once a Scoundrel. Like we go all over the place with this.
Well, listeners, if you have any suggestions for the Once a book 3, please let Sarah Arthur know. But in the meantime, we are running out of time right now. But Sarah Arthur, her new book is Once a Queen. Where can we find you? Where can we find your work?
Yeah, you can head on over to saraharthur.com. That's Sarah with an H. And there's all kinds of information there about Once a Queen, including some of the fabulous pre-order perks that my publisher is offering, and lots of different places to pick up the book.
Awesome. Well, thank you once again for joining the table again. And again, listeners, please keep a lookout for this. And also, listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Society Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. If you have a few extra seconds to spare, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.